Good evening. This is Professor Aminah Al-Deen. Salam alaikum to our listening audience. This is a live broadcast which will also be recorded on Muslim Network TV. And this is Critical Talk, a production of Sound Visions. Please tune in to us. We're trying to cover a great deal, and Muslim Network News is just doing yeoman women job, as they cover the news across the globe. I thought that today, since in the news, the media seems to be only able to cover one thing at a time, that we would look at another crisis, perhaps a larger crisis, but not a crisis where members of the country live in significant numbers here in the United States. I have with me this evening Mustafa Dafalla, who is an American of Sudanese descent, a 2009 MIT graduate, and he does a lot of stuff. Let me see if I can hit on some of it. While his degree is in civil and environmental engineering, he's all over the place. He's doing environmental strategies, one place. He's an award winner of the MIT Davis Peace Prize, another place. He's worked uh, with advising on national strategies on yet another place. Uh, Looked at food security, production optimization, and in the Sudan post revolution, Mustafa advised the Minister of Cabinet Affairs on establishing the National Council for Strategic Planning and a whole bunch of other stuff that I wouldn't have any time left for the show if I read it all. I wanted to come to the Sudan because as I move around the continent, I think that many Americans don't have a clue really as to where Sudan is,
Right.
how large it is, what it's in the neighborhood of. And it is in the neighborhood of lots of stuff, none of which is good. But before we get to Sudan, because I know you dibble and dabble everywhere, can you give us a little bit of an overview of what's happening in East Africa in general?
Sure. Well, first, thank you so much, Dr. Dean, for having me. It's great to be here and to great to be with the audience. I think that this is an interesting and important topic. We're at really a inflection point when it comes to Africa in general, that the whole world seems to not really be talking about or not really noticing. Throughout the entire Sahel region, you have seen a number of military coups take place.
Yes.
You've seen some overthrows in governments. You've seen a lot of turmoil as it relates to the IGAD, or the African organization that's responsible for dealing with a lot of the natural crises happening, and some of those are caused as a direct result of the situation in Sudan, but some of them are more linked to kind of the broader issues. You're seeing a significant, maybe we call it a changing of the guard, so to speak, and that you're seeing a lot of people within, or what you're seeing is that the former colonial powers, be they French, be they American, within the African context, being either in the United States case being asked to leave, or in the French case being forced out of the country. So you're seeing that in Niger, you're seeing that in Mali, and that's further west. As you kind of move across, you're seeing a controversial election into Chad as you move eastward, and then you're seeing things flare. Obviously, a lot happening in Sudan, and we'll get to that in a bit. Meanwhile, you're seeing the issues in Somalia, Ethiopia, and some of the challenges that you're seeing are a lot of these are very historic problems related to like access to resources, whether it's access to ports, whether it's access to electricity, and you're just basically seeing a whole tapestry of issues come to a head. But I would say that the most notable, most significant trend that you're seeing is that while the world seems to be looking elsewhere, there's really a fundamental shift in the power structure, or I would say especially the external power structures that used to exist within Africa. I think you're seeing a major movement. You're seeing significant interest from China, significant interest in Russia, and
Mhm.
obviously a lot more interest from local players as well.
Now, are China and Russia interested because of natural resources or potential buildup of stuff they can use at home?
Yeah, I think you're seeing there are two clear thrusts of the desire to be in Africa. One is definitely the access to resources. So you're seeing a significant amount for in Sudan. There's a significant amount of investment from China in the Sudanese oil industry. You're seeing with the link, focusing on Sudan, there was a significant investment from the Russian paramilitary Wagner group in the Sudanese gold and mining industry. Sudan being the third largest producer of gold on the continent. And so there's a significant amount of resources. I think Niger, one of the largest producers of uranium in the world. And so when the French were forced to leave and the United States are being asked to leave, so there's definitely a natural resources play there. Um, but I think that is squarely one part of the story. I think the other equally important part of the story is it's simply a geopolitical sphere of influence play, in where basically while the world is being distracted elsewhere, I think that there's a very clear gap that's being created, and there is a vacuum that is being created that the other rising or emerging powers are looking to fill, and in doing so, basically solidifying their geopolitical dominance. And so, evidence of this was there was significant talk from the time of Omar al-Bashir before his overthrow, through the transitional government, and even post the transition, about the establishment of a Russian naval base in the Port Sudan Sawakin area. So that's a major component. So yes, resources, but geopolitics for sure.
Okay, I'm a little slow. What is geopolitics? What
Right.
does that mean?
Yeah. I think that the easiest way to kind of absorb what's happening is that in order for countries to project power and to project influence, you can the easiest way to do that is to be adjacent, right? So obviously I'm in a better position to influence my neighbor than I am to influence people further on. So if you think about it as like in like the game of Risk, for those who have played it, but basically the more contiguous I am, or the further along that I'm at, the easier it is for me to establish a base there, and then be able to project my influence further. And so, whether that is military influence by actually putting military bases in places, or whether it's economic influence. So, if I'm able to establish a pipeline or a railroad, so you can think of that like similar to the Chinese Belt and Road system from China all the way to Europe. So, similarly, by establishing deep economic networks, you're able to establish economic influence in certain countries. And so what that then means is that when you want things done, for example, for the longest time, what we were seeing in Niger was a successive cycle of revolutions that were happening. What that with the French dominance in that country, what that enabled was a essentially a control of resources remotely. So you didn't need to physically be there; you could control the resources. So when we talk about geopolitics, we're talking about the effect of the geography on your ability to influence politics, whether it's in that country or in other countries.
Well, lesson number one. Um, Number two, if for when we say, you can ask the United States to leave, and the United States typically says, "Yeah, right," and doesn't go anywhere,
Right.
in all the ways that one cannot go anywhere. But if these Western powers no longer had access to a serious wealth of resources on the continent, can they provide their own resources?
Yeah, I think that there's been a pretty big misconception when it comes to the need for resources in, for example, places like the United States. The United States is largely self sufficient across most resources, including oil and gas. So, the United States, a few years ago, I think, became a net exporter of oil, plus this big transition towards big transition towards alternative energy. If you look at Europe, they're in a worse position because they're getting a lot of their either natural gas from Russia or gas from Qatar.
Yeah,
But in terms of the essential resources, a lot of it is getting produced domestically. I think that the and I think that because of this reducing need for raw mineral and resource extraction, I think that has sort of explained why the Western powers have been more and more willing to sort of I would say, reduce their grip on a lot of these places because I think that the need for these resources aren't as strong. Now, there are some places where this is obviously still very true. For example, Niger will be interesting to follow that very closely because uranium tends to be one of those resources that you can't just find anywhere. And so that might be something that they continue to look at. Uh,
yeah,
but I think that the Western powers, I don't think the question is going to be whether or not they're going to be able to provide resources for themselves. I think we live in a sufficiently globalized market. They're going to be able to get the resources that they need. I think the real question is, to what degree are you going to be able to influence countries and nations and players to do the things that you want them to do? So if you're looking at if you think the biggest problem that Africa poses to Europe, for example, is the migrant situation, right? So you have a lot of people who are fleeing conflict areas within Africa, and a lot of them are then fleeing to Europe. The greater the instability is on the African continent, the greater pressure that causes elsewhere in the world. And I think that becomes some of the more major issues that they're looking to deal with.
well,
And,
don't these leaders realize that if they keep up the fights and their bickering and carrying on, and people have to flee, um, well, number one, who are they going to govern if everybody runs away? And number two, for the migrant, they're going into hostile territory.
Yeah, I think the leaders themselves, and now if we, I guess, focus on Sudan, I think the situation in Sudan is a little different. I think that the war is really it's really an existential war where
What does that mean?
I think that there are two political ideologies that are currently emerging. What you're seeing is one camp where the well, before we get into that, maybe let me provide a bit of context. So, the entire country in 2019 basically came out and said we want a new change, we want to change, we want to overthrow the government, got rid of the Omar al-Bashir. There was a revolution. And that revolution came about, there was this kind of joint agreement between the Forces of Freedom and Change, which is basically the civilian government, and the military, and they said, okay, we're going to jointly run the country for about 4 years, and then we'll have elections. Within those 4 years, it would be led by the military for 2 years, then the civilians for 2 years, then elections. Then in 2022, the military in a coup basically said, we'll take all of that power, thank you very much, and we do not need the civilians at all. The problem was is that in that moment there were actually two militaries. You had the SAF, which is the Sudanese military. You had the RSF, which were the Rapid Support Forces, and they were sort of jointly ruling the country. Over time, what you saw was a deep fission between, or fissure, separation between the Sudanese military and the RSF. And for a long time, the people in Sudan were, broadly speaking, indifferent between which of these two would basically make it to the top. And ultimately, they just kind of figured that they were in a situation where they would just have to accept whatever the outcome was. I think what ended up happening, however, was when with the outbreak of this war, which was in April of last year, so we're just a little bit over 12 months we're about 13 months into this war. When that war broke out, the idea was actually that this wasn't going to be a war. The RSF had been sufficiently embedded within the entire country, within the important elements of the country, meaning the TV, the royal palace, the most of the major security apparatuses within the government, so that they figured that within 24 to 72 hours, they would fully overthrow the government, overthrow the Sudanese military, and they would just kind of take over, and then there would be a new government in place, and that would be the end of that chapter. Fortunately or unfortunately, that did not happen. And so what ended up happening was the Sudanese military ended up being much stronger, much more capable than what they had expected. And so what ended up happening, what they thought was going to be a 24 to 72-hour war, ended up being a year-long conflict where the military, who over the past 4 years had been using the RSF as their infantry, have basically now been fighting back to regain land and capital. So the reason why I call this now an existential war is because the RSF, rather than fight this war as if they wanted to govern, they've chosen a scorched earth policy, where because they don't have the ability to govern, everywhere that they go, there's widespread reports of rape, of pillaging, of destruction. And so they've really lost. So unlike, for example, situations in Yemen and in Libya and in these other areas where you would have competing factions, each faction would sort of take over an area and say, this is the area that I'm going to govern. The reason why that tends to not be viable in Sudan is wherever the RSF goes, it's basically horror and destruction. And so they've gotten very deep hatred, or they've garnered the hatred of the entire Sudanese population now, including a genocide part two that they've delivered in Darfur. So all of this to say that in Sudan now, the way that people see the war, they don't see it as a war between two generals that are bickering. They see it as the existence of the state and a rogue militia that's being funded by outside sources that is trying to basically hijack the government. And that's...
Well, wait a minute. Wait a minute.
Mhm.
What is the vision for Sudan and its people? I haven't heard anything about vision.
Right. So after the revolution, there was a vision of a thriving democracy where the people would finally get the things that they've always wanted and the things that they've wanted to achieve. I
Such
think...
as,
What was that?
such as.
Well, for example, the ability to have electricity, the ability to have running water throughout the entire country, the ability to have the basics, but not just the basics. There was really a certain sense of euphoria that this with this revolution that they would solve these issues of corruption, that the country would now be basically on its way, leveraging its immense natural resources, whether it was the gold, whether it was agriculture, whether it was
Okay.
trade, opening up the tourism industry, and really just bringing the country into the 21st century.
Okay.
That was I wouldn't even use the term vision because that implies that there's a plan and course of action. I would say that that was the aspiration, and that's
Okay.
where people wanted to go. Unfortunately, the gap between that aspiration and turning it into a workable plan, it was abruptly aborted in October 2022 when the military coup happened. Right, that first coup that happened in 2022 really put all of those plans on hold. And so now, what everyone is hoping for, different camps want this war to end differently. But however the war ends, the idea is once this war does end, that we then go back on the track of a of nation building, essentially, where the country then you have a functioning democratic system that then reduces, and then the country can then go about the business uh, of leveraging their resources for the good of the country. But right now, they're not there yet. No one's focusing on that right now.
I'm going to take a quick break, couple of minutes. This is Professor Aminah Al-Deen. I'm talking with Mustafa Dafalla, who's giving me a different kind of view of what's going on, not only in Sudan, but where it sits in a larger picture of what's going on. And we're going to come back and talk about what happens after genocide over here, genocide over there, total devastation of this over here, and North, South, and Western Sudan. And let's put up some maps. We'll be right back. Good evening. Salam alaikum. This is Professor Aminah Al-Deen, and Critical Talk tonight on Muslim Network TV is talking about the Sudan. Crises upon crises. And we left the first part of the show talking about what happens after genocide. I'm watching, I'm reading, you know, if you survive a genocide or total destruction of where you used to live, you can't forget it. What are you doing psychologically to a people that you want to bring back to getting on the road to nation building?
Right. I think that that's an important question, and I think that at at the individual level, it's probably death. It's easy to talk about things. We once you give a label to something, it's easy to talk about. But people who experience that experiential thing is very different, right? I think that the if we look at it from a national perspective, um, if a genocide takes place, what it means is that the fundamental institutions or organs of that government have failed those
Yeah,
people. And the only way to move forward as a country is to take a serious look at those organs that have failed, figure out how to replace those organs, and then to figure out how are you going to then rebuild the trust in those institutions and those governments. I think that there are very different, uh, you know, at one level of abstraction, genocide is the same. It's basically the death and destruction of a group of people based on their ethnicity or religion, and it's terrible and it's awful. But I think that depending on the motivations of the genocide, depending on the specifics, I think that the way forward is it can be very different. I think in the issue of Sudan, you have some serious challenges when you look at the problem of Darfur, where you have a tribe of people.
map up so we can see which regions we're talking about. Go ahead.
So if you look at the area of Darfur, which for your viewers or the people who are watching, this area is not a small area. It's probably about the size of California. Um, when the people here in Darfur, basically, you have two major, I guess, tribes or ethnic groups, and you have the Misalit, which were a big tribe that are the victims of the current genocide. And you have the Rezegat, who another tribe. Now, the Western media and a lot of people have described these as Arab and African tribes, but I think that nomenclature um, muddies the waters because they physically look the same and a lot of and speak the same language. I think a better delineation would be that one tribe tend to be nomadic and the others tend to be um, settlers or farmers. And it's the nomadic tribes that have been executing and carrying out the genocide against the Misalit. And if you were to ask the people in Sudan, they say that a lot of these issues and conflicts have gone on for centuries, and that the specific problem of what we're seeing today is that one group happens to be significantly more armed than the other group, and
Mm,
that's what's enabling kind of the current genocide. The reason why I began the conversation with organ failure is that in 2024, it doesn't make sense that you would have that you would have a conflict on the basis of fighting for pasture for your cattle, right? Or fighting for access to water or access to, um, you know, basic resources We're not talking about, not necessarily talking about oil or any kind of high cash crops. We're really talking about basic resources. And so I think the way that you move forward, as obviously there will need to be a way to make people some sort of equivalent of reparations, some way to kind of make amends for what happens, in some way to fix that. But I think that at a deeper level and at a more structural level, at the country level, what needs to happen is that you need to provide the resources for the people throughout the entire country, where they're moving from a subsistence existence to one in which people are able to to move up the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and creating these kind of the underlying causes of these conflicts, and in the case of Darfur, a genocide. What needs to happen is you need to remove these underlying causes, and I think that that's the only way, is in the Sudanese context, that you're able to move past this situation. And that's the way that I see it. I don't know if that answers the question.
Well, look at this map. You have northern Sudan, I guess, in yellow. Uh, but northern Sudan is also in purple. I think the map is miscolored. And you have this tiny region in the south called South Sudan.
Well, yeah, I think this map is slightly cut off. So I think it was in 2015.
Give me another map, Miriam. Go ahead.
You had the north and the south. Well, no, this map is accurate. So you had the north and the south split. So South Sudan is its own independent country. So what you see on this map is you see Northern Sudan and South Sudan. Northern Sudan referring to the region of Sudan that happens to be in the north. Whereas South Sudan, what you're seeing is like that's the beginning of another country, which is now called South Sudan.
Okay, well, what's purple?
Sure. So what you see here, the major regions in Sudan, you have the northern part, central, eastern. You have Kordofan and Darfur, which is called Western Sudan. And so these regions are useful when thinking about the country as a whole, but because of a lack of general infrastructure, these divisions are not as stark as they may appear on the map. So basically, the tribal boundaries will sort of bleed in from one area to another, and you'll see. But basically, what you have in northern Sudan, these are you'll find a lot of the Nubian tribes, the people who have deeper ethnic ties with those of southern Egypt, eastern Sudan. Basically, as you look at this map, the ethnic ties tend to be closer to those countries that you see border them. So in Darfur, you'll see the ethnic tribes are very similar to those in Chad and in Central African Republic.
Okay.
Across the border, you'll see the tribes that are closer to southern Sudan or South Sudan. That's the Denka, the Nuer. And in eastern Sudan, well, you'll see a lot more relationships with Ethiopia, Somalia, Eritrea. And so Sudan is home to anywhere between, depending on which estimates you look at, between 50 to 600 different tribes. And these tribes, most of them speak different languages. The lingua franca is Arabic, but and in central Sudan, Arabic is spoken exclusively. That's that little blue part in the middle.
Yeah.
But in all of the other regions, there will be a multitude of other languages that are spoken.
So when I was reading Northern Sudan, Central, and Kurdifah, I guess, and some of Eastern, literacy rates are high, like 75 to 80%. But in Southern Sudan, the literacy is all the way down to 20, 25%. But in Southern Sudan, which has the majority of the oil, how are they going to administer it and make it work for their infrastructure needs?
Right. So when we talk about South Sudan, we're introducing an important but complex layer. So South Sudan gained its independence after a referendum. There was the 2011 comprehensive peace agreement that ended over 50 years of civil war between the North and the South, led by John Gedden, and then John Gedden, who was the president of, or he was basically the president elect of South Sudan, who fatally died in a airplane or a helicopter incident, was then succeeded by Silva Care, who then ran the southern country, the southern part of then, which was just one Sudan, and then in 2015 they held a referendum and split. Now, we can get into, but I think it would probably require a larger discussion as to, the education and the poverty of South Sudan. And a lot of people would point to that as the fundamental reason why they chose to split from the North in the first place. But yeah, I mean, happy to talk about it. But I think that it's a fundamentally different problem. I think the access to the natural resources um, is only one issue. I think the one of the reasons why the literacy rates in the North are so high is because the North is predominantly a Muslim population. The reading of the Quran is a big part of the culture across the country, and so that requires obviously literacy so that you can actually read the Quran. In South Sudan, because it's primarily Christian and animist, a large part of it is animist. There's not really a culture, or there's not
Mm.
that forcing function to drive literacy. So that's a big part of it.
So, can we see some of the other maps that we have, Miriam? As we look at, especially the one that kind of shows the crises. Uh, the crisis is this scorched earth policy. It is uh, genocide in some areas, wiping out, I guess, tribes who are resistant to the rule. Um, the numbers continue. Miriam, um, to increase with regard to those who have been displaced. They're going into other countries. Can't see that. That's too small.
Yeah, can you scroll down a bit? Yeah, I think when there we go. Um, yeah, I'm sorry. So your question was around which element exactly?
The numbers are rising. It is, if not already, um, in the news to be the largest crisis in terms of displaced persons, in terms of numbers of people killed and displaced, meaning that people no longer live in their homes but are either on the streets or living somewhere else in a city, or have taken refuge in rural areas.
Right,
Um, this is a horrible crisis. And
right.
UNICEF seems to be the only people providing humanitarian aid that I could see.
Yeah, the humanitarian situation in Sudan is definitely dire. It's exacerbated by the fact that a lot of the agencies or actors that have been purportedly trying to deliver aid have proven to be bad faith actors. You have people like the RSF who are actively hijacking aid convoys, actively targeting
Countries.
the people themselves, and not
Mexico's
only
Green.
that, I think it's further complicated by the fact that in Sudan, for example, the a lot of the grain reserves, a lot of the food
Full
stockpiles
screen.
that did exist in some of the other cities. So maybe just for brief context, uh, most of the fighting began in Khartoum, and that's the bright yellow spot that you see right in the middle of this map. That's where the fighting began. That's where a lot of it really began, and then you can see it moved outwards into some of the other major centers. The It's the scorched earth policy in some of these other areas outside of the major cities that have really caused a lot of the humanitarian disaster. So obviously when there's fighting and killing in a major city, you're going to see a large number of people displaced. That
Mm-hmm.
that catastrophe was, to some degree, I don't want to minimize it, but to some degree was mitigated because, given the size of Sudan, given the fact that Khartoum being the metropolitan center, but many people having family outside of the capital, were able to sort of go to the villages essentially. What happened was that the RSF then began attacking a lot of the supply lines, not military supply lines, but culture, but the country's resource supply lines in terms of roads, um, um, granaries, where the country was for in the Al Jazeera state, where they were pushing. Let's see if we can see. Yes, so if you see just south of Khartoum, you see that light blue area, which is Al Jazeera. Now that is actually the breadbasket of the country. And so
Oh,
when the RSF came there and they began attacking the wheat and grain stores, that had huge effects on the country, not least of all because what happened was, in that area, a lot of people who had fled Khartoum had found shelter and safety in Al Jazeera. So what you're seeing is that what started off as a relatively localized conflict in Khartoum. Now, Khartoum is the most populous city. It's the nation's capital. So even if the war had stayed there, it would have been a big enough tragedy. But the fact that the RSF has then gone out and actually attacked the safe havens that people were fleeing to, that's what made it an even bigger problem. And so that's kind of what you're seeing. And I think that what we're seeing over the past few months, at least since the beginning of 2024, is you're really seeing that the Sudanese military is retaking a lot of the land. You're seeing people begin to return to Khartoum. I don't want to paint too rosy of a picture, but the sentiment on the ground really is that the people believe they no longer view this as a war between two generals. They really view this as the whole country on one side and the RSF backed by foreign agents on the other. And the whole country is really kind of arming themselves for this. Now, this opens up its own problems. We may be having another conversation where a full out civil war breaks out. This, in the eyes of
now
most,
the map, Miriam. Go ahead.
yeah, this in the eyes of the Sudanese isn't quite considered a civil war, but rather a proper war between the military and the people on one side, and the RSF on the other.
You know, one wonders. I think you said it near the beginning that you see countries asking the United States and some others to leave, forcing others like France out. Uh, they don't seem, well, they have a kind of aspirational picture of who they could be,
Right.
maybe not a way to get there because so many uh, and I don't want to say post colonial because for me it's still colonial, but the way lines and animosities have been fueled between tribes and, with redrawing borders and folk trying to make sure that they still have place on some map somewhere.
Right.
Um, I don't know how one begins to step back and look at this daunting, in many ways, picture. You have right, I want to say, in your neighborhood, not quite your next door neighbor, but in your neighborhood, the mess in Gaza. I don't even know if we can call it Gaza anymore. And folk running hither and there, being told to run here, get massacred, and then, well, no, go there. You have what is obviously going to be uh, uh, a move into Lebanon and Jordan. You have Yemen still bickering.
Right.
You have Ethiopia, is a very interesting place, but the tribes are not peaceful.
Right.
They're not sitting down. What, when one steps back, can be done? I mean, if we move west, we got Gambia, which doesn't have a healthcare system.
Right.
We got droughts, we got famines, we got, you name it, we got it.
Yeah, I think that what do they say? The If the task is to eat an elephant, the way to do it is just one bite at a time. And so I think that if we were to try to look at all of these problems and try to paint a picture that solves all of them, I think that that becomes very difficult. I think that that
That's
challenge
unfolding.
is
But we can
impossible.
step back
But if
and see where some things are sticking out.
I think that the simplest, most common thread for resolution of conflict and economic challenges, it can really be found in governance. Now, the question is how do you get to good governance? And that is a much
A
longer,
big one. Hmm.
that's a much longer discussion. But what gives me hope is that all of the countries that you've mentioned, none of them have a dearth of intellectuals. None of them lack skilled professionals. Least of all, Sudan. Sudan has um, experts and intellectuals in pretty much any field that you can imagine. And so, after the revolution, it took no time at all for people to fly in from all over the world, including US professors, people from Europe, people from the Middle East were willing to come in and donate their time and intellectual horsepower in order to move the needle. I think that once we are able to get to a place of relative stability, and that's really all you need, things just need to be relatively stable and stable enough such that the people can get about doing their job. I think that you will begin to start to see things change, and things can change very quickly. I think that that is, if there's one advantage that the developing world has, it is the advantage that we live in an age where there is so much technology and industrial horsepower that once the process begins, I think that success can be accelerated, and I think that you can, faster than people really imagine, things can change. But I think that there needs to first we need to first get that activation energy and first get to that plateau of relative stability. I don't think it's too far away, and I think once we get there, I think we'll all be pleasantly surprised.
Well, needless to say, I hope it comes soon.
Indeed, we all do.
I know. I don't see it coming for a minute, but at least we can think about, okay, when it gets here, we'll have what we need to do quickly before some other idiots decide they want to fight,
Right,
um, and go ahead. I have been energized this evening talking about the Sudan because it's not in the news.
right.
I
And
mean,
maybe
it's
it's
just your
better.
news, not my news, huh?
Maybe that's better off, in my opinion. I have a very, maybe different approach to this. I get asked all the time, my friends, whether they're Palestinian or otherwise, who say, how do you feel that we're only talking about Gaza all the time? And I say, I think that's great. Because I don't see excessive international attention or any international attention making any impact. Definitely, I've not seen it make a positive impact, and we see that in Gaza.
Wow.
We've seen 7 months of nonstop coverage. I don't think that has made a positive impact. And I think oftentimes it can lead to a negative impact.
Yeah,
And so I think that Sudan has been flying under the radar for decades. And I think that currently what's needed is this war needs to come to an end, a just and swift end. And once it does, I think that that we can get back to the business of building something that the future generations can really be proud of.
on that note, this is Professor Aminah Al-Deen. I've had the pleasure and been informed by Mr. Mustafa Dafalla on what's happening on the continent and especially with the crisis in Sudan. I can't thank you enough
Thank you so much.
for coming on Critical Talk and sharing this information about, when you said for good or bad, but people need to know.
Sure. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. It's really been a pleasure. Always a pleasure, Dr. Abna. Appreciate it.
Okay, stay around. This has been another program of Critical Talk, which is a production of Sound Vision on Muslim Network TV. Please tune in. We're on every Monday night. Assalamu alaikum.